Help us. 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 Help us.
Paul suddenly woke up, and he was covered in sweat. It was all a dream. Or was it? There's a man in the dream who kept saying, "Help us." And he looked dressed like someone from Macedonia. He had that kind of clothes. Someone from Macedonia in Greece. Was this a sign? Was this God's way of saying, "Paul, get your butt to Macedonia. The people there need your help"? So Paul packed up and left that very morning for Macedonia, Greece, and thus the next stage in AD history began, and like many world-changing moments, it began with a dream. Acts 16. They went down to Troas. Troas, it's up here, is named for the nearby city of Troy, which is where the infamous Battle of Troy happened with the Trojan horse and the walls and Brad Pitt without his shirt on. It's that Troy. And Troas is in the bigger area of Asia Minor, which is the westernmost tip of Asia. And it's been 15 years since Saul killed Stephen, then became a Christian and changed his name to Paul. And during that 15-year period, Paul's been traveling and taking Christianity all through Asia Minor, which means that Christianity was an Asian and Middle Eastern religion before it ever was a European or North American one. Which means the first Christians probably looked more like this, or this, than they ever really looked like this. Christianity did not begin as a Western religion. It's an Eastern religion. Acts 16, they went down to Troas, and during the night, Paul had a vision of a man of Macedonia standing and begging him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." That's the dream I described at the beginning. Help us. And after Paul had seen the vision, we got ready at once, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. From Troas, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. So they go from Troas and they sail up to Philippi, which is in Macedonia, where the dream told them to go. It's a short journey. It's barely a centimeter on the map. Back when it was on my screen, now it's like a foot. But it represents a massive moment in history. You see, Troas is in Asia. Philippi is in Europe. For the first time ever recorded in the Bible, Christianity has gone from a Middle Eastern and Asian religion to a European religion. Christianity has come to the West. Acts 16:13. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate at Philippi to the river. And if you look at the back here, I have a picture there of the Gangetes River, which is the closest river outside of the city of Philippi, and likely the river he was talking about. So on the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the woman who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, and she was a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message, When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. A Macedonian man may have called for Paul to come help, but it's a Macedonian woman who becomes the first Christian in European history. Acts 16:16. While we were in Philippi, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners by fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us, shouting, these men are servants of the Most High God who are telling you the way to be saved. I think she meant that as an insult, but it's inadvertently free advertising for them. She kept this up for many days. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit in her, in the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her. And at that moment, the spirit left her. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas. Silas is one of Paul's traveling buddies. And they dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. So Paul casts a frickin' demon out of this girl, but with it her fortune-telling abilities apparently also disappear, and her unique talent is gone, and Paul has just cost her slave owner a bunch of money. And he's not too thrilled about it. They brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews. Christianity hadn't really been around long enough at this point for people to understand the differences between Judaism and Christianity. So these Philippians just sort of lump them into one big group here, sort of like how white people tend to lump Chinese, Korean, and Japanese into the one category of Asian. You guys must hate that. It's the same thing here. They brought them before the magistrates and said, these men are Jews and are throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice. So the slave owner's ticked off because he just lost some money on this slave girl, and so he basically just makes up whatever accusation he needs to get Paul in trouble and to get his revenge. The crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they'd been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. You might want to close your eyes for the next part if you have a sensitive stomach. This is a modern picture that shows the impact of a rod beating and what it can do to the human body. This is the sort of physical pain Paul went through. And I imagine there was also a lot of emotional pain as Paul remembered what he'd done to Stephen. And perhaps for that moment, in the first time in his life, he truly understood the horror of what he used to do to people before he became a Christian. After the beating, Paul was placed in stocks. So something like this, where the feet and potentially the hands are locked in to this wooden structure. And then they put him inside the inner cell of the Philippian jail. Archaeologists recently uncovered what could be an ancient jail, and it's in Philippi from the exact time period, so it's possible that this is the exact spot that Paul was placed that night. Imagine it. Stuck in a dark, moldy, underground, cold stone prison, locked in the stocks so you can't move or turn over or adjust. He had no strength left to stay sitting up, but if he lays down, he'll lean back onto his rod wounds, and excruciating pain is going to be sent throughout the rest of his body. Unable to keep straight what is just damp liquid from the earth, what is sewage from past prisoners' urine, and what is his own blood. Paul, the one who came to Macedonia to help, seems like he is now the one who needs help. The dream of Macedonia has become a nightmare. Acts 16:16. About midnight, Paul and Silas began praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. What a gritty yet powerful scene, as suddenly a voice pierces the darkness of the prison, lyrics echoing off the stone walls and immersing the prisoners in something higher than the painful circumstances of the moment. Paul, shackled and in agony, still manages to invent Jailhouse Rock. About midnight, Paul and Silas began praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, all the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. The jailer woke up, and when he saw the prison doors open, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself because he thought the prisoners had escaped. You might think, oh, that's a bit of an overreaction, but it actually isn't. See, it was custom in Roman law back then that if you let your prisoners escape, you would be killed. That was how they prevented guards from being bribed or slacking on the job, because if someone got out, you're going to take their place. So when this jailer realizes the prison doors are open, he thinks the prisoners have got out, and he decides to die on his own terms rather than wait till morning to be executed. But Paul shouted, "Don't harm yourself, we're all here." Paul totally could have escaped, protected his own life, and let the jailer face the punishment, but instead he sticks around and saves the man's life. The jailer called for lights, rushed in, and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He then brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" Something in that earthquake must have shook his soul. "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your whole household." Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer washed their wounds, and they washed his soul. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them. He was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. That's the story of Acts 16, Paul in Philippi. And it was quite a provocative story for the time. Remember that back then they had a saying, "Thank you, God, that I'm not a woman, a slave, a Gentile, or a dog." Well, today in Philippi, Paul baptized a woman, Lydia, then he helped a female slave, and he topped it all off by baptizing a Gentile prison guard. What does this mean? It means that next week, in the next logical step of AD history, Paul is going to baptize a dog. That's not what it means. What it means is that Paul just broke down three major barriers in ancient society. Paul just valued and included women, slaves, and Gentiles into the church. In one day in Philippi, Paul simultaneously deconstructed ancient cultural codes around gender, social class, and ethnicity. Not bad. But there's something even deeper going on here in Philippi. You see, in a few weeks, Paul's going to leave Philippi and he's going to go plant a church in a different city. But in order to keep up with the friends he made and the Christians he baptized in Philippi, he's going to start writing them letters. And they'll keep these letters, and decades later, these letters will be included in the New Testament Bible and called Philippians. Because Paul wrote it to the people in Philippi. Philippians, see what happened there? And the letter to the Philippians is often called the letters of joy. Because Paul uses the word joy in Philippians more than any other place in the Bible, 16 times in total, one after the other, which is interesting because Philippi put him in prison and beat him and put him in stocks. And you know what? When he wrote the book of Philippians to the Philippians, he was in Rome in prison. You wouldn't think Philippi would remind him of joy. You wouldn't think he'd have all these joyful memories of Philippi, but somehow he's still full of joy. That's a theme in Acts 16 too. When the jailer gets baptized, he is filled with joy. Even though he just let the prisoners out into his house and he's probably going to get fired the next morning, he doesn't care. Joy. And even after being beaten, locked in the stocks, and thrown into a dark, damp prison cell, Paul at midnight begins to sing and praise God, and all the prisoners listen to his audible joy. I mean, Paul's got the joy, 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 joy down in his heart, but how the heck did it get there? Because it's certainly not coming from the world around him. Is Paul just faking it? I mean, we all know people who smile all the time and they're hyper happy even when it's super early in the morning and you just want to punch them. and you're just like, you're just faking it. This is just a show you put on to cover your inner emptiness. What's going on? How is Paul, how's Philippi, how's the letter to the Philippians so full of joy despite the so unjoyful circumstances? Well, our culture tends to base its happiness on what's happening around us, on our circumstances in this world. Happiness depends on what's happening to me. If people treat me good, if things are going well in my life, then I'm happy. If my circumstances around me are unfavorable, then I'm unhappy. If I don't get that job, or I don't meet that special someone, or a family member gets sick, then I'm unhappy. Our society's happiness is based entirely on the circumstances, on what's happening to us in the world. We're trying to find our joy in the world around us. And I think there's a few reasons why that doesn't work. First, sometimes the world around us sucks. As Mick Jagger said, you can't always get what you want. Most of us won't make lots of money. Most of us, except Conrad, won't be one of the hot people in the magazines. What if you don't get the grades you needed, or don't get into the university your parents wanted you to, or you don't make that job and you look like an idiot in that job interview? What if you're not successful? What if you legitimately missed your one opportunity with that guy or girl and now it's too late? Statistically, 10 to 15% of us in any crowd will never find a special someone and get married. Even the ones that do, life isn't going to get suddenly circumstantially better overnight. Relationships are hard. They can elevate you to the highest heights, but they can take you so low as well. What happens if one of you struggles with depression or daddy issues or anger problems? What happens if your future spouse has a miscarriage? What happens when your parents and loved ones start to die, as they inevitably will with time? If your emotional stability and happiness depends entirely on the world around you, you're in for a lifetime of emptiness and disappointment. In fact, what AD history precisely shows us is that worldly circumstances don't last. Wealth gets spent, kingdoms fall, ideologies fade, every person, every family member and loved one, even kings and queens, die. Every generation thinks it's above history, that time will never catch up with it, that the party will never end. But the same generation that lived through the party of the Roaring Twenties also lived through the economic depression of the 30s. The same generation that lived through the love and peace of the 60s also lived through the Cold War and the constant threat of an atomic bomb. One century there is joy and peace. The next your friends and your children are off to war. One decade you're hot stuff. The next decade you wake up and you're old and you're beginning to wrinkle. One year everything's great. The next year there's an economic depression and circumstances change. 1 month your relationship's going great, and then life happens and you don't know what happened. One day you're successful, the next day the world is crumbling around you. One moment you feel on top of the world, then you get a phone call, and the world comes collapsing down around you. One morning, you're Paul, traveling through Europe, and by night, you're bleeding in prison. Basing your joy entirely on your worldly circumstances is like building your house on sand. When the winds come, and they will come, the sand will crumble beneath you, and you will crumble with it, lost to the sea. If your circumstances need to be working out for you all the time to be happy, you're not going to be happy for very long. You will ride up and down as the world goes up and down. You will become a slave to your circumstances. Yet even when we do get what we want, even when our circumstances are perfect, we're often still not truly satisfied. How often have you waited years to get something or achieve something only to realize it didn't magically fix that hole in your heart? I mean, when I first get something, I can kind of ride the high and the excitement of it for a while, but then that eventually fades, and if I was unhappy before, I'm unhappy again after. I once heard a story of a football player, and he was talking about the night that his team won the Super Bowl. I mean, he'd been chasing after the Super Bowl his whole life, since he was a kid in high school and then through college, and everything had been leading up to this moment, this night when he won the Super Bowl. And he won it, and the party was great, and there was lots of champagne, and everyone was cheering, and it seemed so high. And then he went home, he brushed his teeth, and he went to bed, like every other night before. And when he woke up the next morning, he realized nothing's really changed. And he felt emptier than he'd ever felt before. In fact, he felt so empty, he went out and bought 3 really expensive cars that morning just to try to make himself feel better. You know what the worst day in many people's lives are? The day they finally get what they want. They chase a dream for years and years, believing that if I just get that, then things will be okay, then I will be complete. Then when they finally get it and realize it doesn't fix everything, it can be one of the worst and most anticlimactic moments of their entire life. Especially when you wake up the next morning wondering, if even this couldn't make me happy, then what else possibly can? And I think that's a lot of us too. We go from thing to thing, person to person, and place to place, chasing after happiness and not finding it. We think that if we just got this job, that girl or that guy or that scholarship or that person's approval, then we would be happy. Those outer things might make it feel okay for a while, but ultimately, outer things cannot heal the gaping hole inside of us. The famous Christian and mathematician Blaise Pascal once said, "We all have a God-shaped hole in our hearts." A part of our souls is missing. We have a hole in our hearts that can only ever be filled by God. And until we allow Him to re-enter our hearts and to be the basis of our joy and satisfaction, we will always be incomplete. We can try to fill that God-shaped hole with finite physical things from this world, like money, comfort, relationships, or success. But those are only temporary band-aids. None of them can truly heal us. It's like when a toddler takes those, like a triangular block, and try to fit it through a square hole. It doesn't work. You can try to cram it in there and force it in, but it's not what's meant to fill you. There's a God-shaped hole, and nothing else can fill it, no matter how hard you try. Even the potentially good things like relationships were never meant to be ultimate things. They were never meant to be your ultimate source of meaning and joy. Relationships are good, but they're not God. The only thing that was ever truly meant to fill the hole in our heart is God. The things of this world are temporary, changing, and fleeting, so they only satisfy us for a little while before we feel empty again. But God is eternal, infinite, forever, and so He can satisfy us forever for the rest of our lives. The happiness of our culture is based on the physical world around us, and so it can be taken from us, destroyed, or fade with time as the physical world around us changes with time. But the Christian's joy should be based on the spirit of an undying, unending, eternal God who will always be here for us, who will never fade with time, for He is above and outside of time. In Galatians 5, Paul writes that the fruit of the Spirit is joy. That means the Spirit of God produces joy within us, like an apple tree produces apples. If we invite the Spirit to take root within us and start relying on Him to provide our joy, He will grow joy in our hearts. Our joy doesn't need to come from our circumstances in the world around us, but from the Spirit of God within us. That's why Paul can still sing and be filled with joy in Philippi in spite of his outer circumstances in prison. That's why in his later letter to the Philippians, Paul writes, "I rejoice greatly. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through God who gives me strength." The Roman government can take Paul's freedom. They can take away his food and water. They can take away his youth by beating him within an inch of his life. They can take his physical comfort and put him in the stocks. They can take away all of his good external circumstances. They can take him from his friends and loved ones and lock him away. They can take him away from his job, his money, and his success. But they'll never take Paul's joy. Let me close with a story. It's a story I've told you guys before, so if you've heard it before, just, be patient with me. In the last few years, I became friends with an elderly Christian man who's in his 90s. And I go to his house, and I meet with him and his wife, and they give me lots of tea. And even though he's in his 90s, and his body's completely beginning to fade, his mind is still all there, and we have these amazing conversations. It's hard because both he and his wife, their bodies are on their last lap. They're both in constant pain, and they're in and out of the hospital all the time. And recently I got the courage to ask him about it. And I said in a very timid and scared voice, "How do you handle all of this?" And I sort of just pointed at him. And then I clarified, "How do you handle all the pain and the aging and the fears. Like, what are you doing with all this? And then he laughed graciously, which is good because I thought he might tell me to leave. And he looked me in the eyes and said, "This is the best time of our lives." I was taken aback. It wasn't quite the answer I was expecting. And he continued and he said, "Jonathan, all the things we used to find comfort in are gone. This is the first time in our lives where God is really the only thing keeping us going. All those other things just got in the way and blinded us from true joy. It is precisely when we stop stuffing ourselves with worldly comforts that God has enough room to enter in. Jonathan," he said, "it is in our emptiness that God can fill us and bring us joy." I told you guys that story for the first time 2 years ago, for those of you who remember. And since then, his wife has died. Yet you still see him walking around, going to things, and he's still so playful. If you saw him, you'd feel safe, just in how he talks. And you'd feel okay and content. He still does that. He still has joy, and he still brings joy to the world. But I think perhaps this is where I should distinguish between happiness and joy, because I think there's a difference. I doubt my elderly friend would think happy is the right word for how he feels going through life without his wife. Happiness sounds too bright and bubbly and perky. Happiness is the kind of thing people use to suppress and hide their pain and put a superficial smiley face on it. But I picture joy as somehow different. Joy doesn't pretend there is no pain. Joy doesn't hide the pain, but instead joy finds meaning through and in and despite the pain. Like when a loved one dies and you're just bawling, and then you remember something silly they used to do, and you start laughing through the tears. It's not quite happiness. You don't feel happy, but yet there's something within you that can't quite be described in any other way than as joy. That's what my elderly friend has. Joy. Not a happiness in worldly circumstances, not happiness that pretends everything's okay, but a joy that admits, yeah, the world sucks right now, but still finds meaning anyway. A joy that doesn't come from the circumstances around us and so can rise up within us when the outside world is falling apart. That is how I picture Paul singing in prison in Philippi. He's not all smiley-faced and pretending everything's great. He's broken and he's tired and he's hurting. It's not a pretty picture. It's not the kind of smiley face you want to put on a t-shirt. And when Paul starts singing, he doesn't sound like Carrie Underwood. His voice is pathetic. He has no energy left to carry a tune. He's been beaten within an inch of a life. He interrupts the vocals every few seconds with a gasp of pain. But he keeps on singing anyway, propelled forward by something deeper than circumstance. Singing on in the cold, dark nights, he discovers light in the darkness, the Spirit in the stalks, hope in the horror, God in the ghastly. Joy